The movie begins with a performance at an opera house in Budapest, where a hitman named Joe Flood is present to kill his target, Petrov, a criminal boss. As the performance starts, Petrov sits with his girlfriend while his guards watch over the building, and Joe begins to make his move. Joe's boss calls him to warn him not to spill any blood in the building since the opera house is 139 years old, but Joe still kills the guards one by one. When Joe finally gets to Petrov, Petrov tries to strike a deal by offering Joe triple the payment he was promised. However, Joe declines the offer and immediately kills his target, letting the woman run away. As Joe leaves, he feels an intense headache and dizziness. One of Petrov's men notices the woman fleeing, so he rushes to his boss but arrives too late. On his way out, he's met by the guards in the building and a shootout ensues. The guard informs his colleagues about the situation and requests backup, which leads to Petrov's men getting shot on the stage. Chaos erupts throughout the building, and as a female dancer is trying to leave, she is knocked over, dropping her phone. Joe picks up her phone, helps her to her feet, and leads her out of the building. The woman asks for his name and thanks him, but Joe suddenly experiences another sharp headache. She offers to get him something to drink, but when she turns around, Joe is gone. Joe heads home and realizes he forgot to return the woman's phone. He takes his medication and then lies down to rest. The next day, Joe goes for a checkup to find out why he's experiencing headaches and frequent dizziness. After examining him, Dr. Keegan tells Joe that they didn't find anything but advises him to make some lifestyle changes. Joe goes to see his boss and close friend Zivi and tells him about his health problem. Zivi mentions that the police believe one of Petrov's own men killed him. He hands Joe the payment for the successful mission and advises him to take some time off to relax. Later, Joe visits the rehearsal hall of the dancer, whose name is Maisie, to return her phone. Maisie invites Joe to dinner as a thank you and writes her phone number on a piece of paper for him. Joe leaves and initially throws the paper away, but he later retrieves it. That evening, Joe and Maisie have dinner together, where Maisie talks about her passion for dancing and her dream of starting a dance school for children. Joe shares that he plans to retire from his job. As the night goes on and their conversation deepens, it's clear that a romantic connection is forming between them. In the days that follow, Joe begins courting Maisie. They seem happy together, but Joe continues working as a hitman for criminals. One day, Joe meets Zivi at a restaurant and tells him about Maisie. He also expresses his desire to retire, to which Zivi responds that it would be difficult, but he'll see what he can do. During their conversation, Joe once again experiences a sharp headache and tells Zivi that he's still waiting for test results from Dr. Keegan. Joe asks Zivi to help him get a life insurance policy, but Zivi reminds him that their line of work doesn't offer such things, so Joe suggests they fake one so Maisie won't suspect anything. One night, Joe celebrates his birthday at a restaurant with Zivi, Zivi's wife Sharon, Maisie, and one of her friends. When Joe and Zivi are alone, Zivi advises Joe to come clean to Maisie about everything before it's too late. The next day, Joe visits his doctor for his test results and is devastated to learn that he has Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. This is a neurological condition in which patients progressively experience blindness, cognitive issues, memory loss, and even speech difficulties. Currently, there is no cure for this disease, and Joe has only about 3 months left. Joe goes home and researches the symptoms of his condition online. Later, he decides to retrieve his hidden money and gathers all his guns to dispose of them in the river. The next day, Joe approaches Zivi with a plan in mind. He asks Zivi to organize a contract, with the target being Joe himself. Joe offers $2 million for the contract, but Zivi is puzzled by the request. Joe explains that his disease will kill him and he doesn't want to prolong his suffering, especially for Maisie to see him in such a state. Joe also hands over all his personal money to be used as life insurance for Maisie after his death. However, as a loyal friend, Zivi refuses to order Joe's death, no matter how much money is involved. With Zivi's refusal, Joe seeks out Antoinette, a former assassin who now manages contracts like Zivi. Their history is complicated because Joe killed Antoinette's father, who was also Joe's mentor, so she holds a personal grudge against him. While Antoinette couldn't hurt Joe in the past due to the rules of their trade, she now has permission and is willing to do it, especially with a $2 million reward. Antoinette introduces her guard, Max, a former American soldier, who now works for her. Since Joe requested it, he is now both the client and the target of his contract, which will begin at midnight. After Joe leaves, Antoinette starts offering the contract to her hitmen, including Dan, who refuses the $2 million offer because it's not enough for a tough hitman like Joe. The first group to accept the offer is a gang of Korean assassins called Goyang, led by a man with the same name. The last to accept are the Langos brothers. That night, Joe meets with Maisie, unaware that Max is tracking them and taking photos. Joe tells Maisie that he has something important to say, and Maisie responds that she also has something to share. To Maisie's shock, Joe says he is leaving the country and will never return, so they must part ways. Heartbroken, Maisie begs for an explanation, but Joe can't give her one. In the end, he gives her a final kiss and leaves. As the Goyang gang approaches, Joe returns home, leaving the door open. He leaves a voicemail for Maisie, explaining that his reason for leaving is due to a terminal illness. Maisie listens to the message while at a bar, drinking. Unexpectedly, Joe gets a call from Dr. Keegan, who tells him there was a mistake with the test results. The lab had mixed up Joe's sample with that of another patient who has the disease, meaning Joe is not sick after all. The doctor also mentions that the cause of Joe's headaches and dizziness remains a mystery, but Joe realizes it's too late since the assassins are already on their way to kill him. Joe immediately prepares traps, and when Goyang's gang enters the house, he tries to explain that there's been a mistake.
Goyang, this was a mistake. I'm canceling the contract.
Fuck you! That's not how it works!
Goyang refuses to cancel the contract and sends his men to face Joe one by one. Despite their skill, Joe defeats them all at once, even one who wields a sword. The last of Goyang's men is a woman armed with 2 knives, but Joe easily overpowers her and knocks her down. Next, Goyang himself attempts to throw a knife at Joe, but Joe is quicker and slashes his face.
I got you.
Joga Goyang.
Joe steps outside and calls Antoinette to request the cancellation of the contract, but Antoinette refuses, determined to avenge her beloved father's death. Joe taunts Antoinette about her father, saying he enjoyed killing him, which enrages her further. She declares that she'll send the best hitmen across Europe to hunt him down. After the call, Joe noticed 2 men on motorcycles waiting for him. He quickly left a voicemail for Maze to inform her that he was in trouble and asked her to retrieve the money he sent so she could leave Budapest and stay safe. Before long, Joe was ambushed by the Langos brothers, who attacked him on their motorcycles. However, being the #1 hitman, Joe easily defeated the assassin brothers and stole one of their bikes. After their failure, Antoinette used her own money and raised the bounty to 4 million, sending the offer to several top assassins. The first to accept the offer was Dan, who finally agreed to the job due to the substantial amount of money. Next, Rory and Angus, 2 brothers, accepted the contract as well. 2 female friends, Ginny and Tanya, also took the job, and finally, a man named Botas joined them. Meanwhile, Maze received Joe's voicemail and immediately left the bar. In the middle of the night, Joe went to Zivi's house to have his wounds treated and explained his situation with Antoinette. Joe knew there was only one way to end this, but Zivi told him he couldn't kill Antoinette as it would violate the rules of their profession. Joe came up with an idea. He wanted Antoinette to think he was running away, so she would send all the assassins to one place where he could kill them all at once. Joe asked Zivi for guns, but Zivi had none at home and instead gave him some explosives. Meanwhile, Dan arrived in Budapest and Antoinette called him to explain the situation with Joe, sending a photo of him with Maze. Antoinette asked for a favor, as Dan's driver would be her male cousin, whom she wanted to train as a hitman to fulfill a promise to her late uncle. The comical guy was named Money, and Antoinette wanted Dan to bring him along as part of his training. Back to Joe, he was getting a massage from Sharon to relieve his pain. Unexpectedly, Sharon accidentally snapped Joe's neck, and to everyone's surprise, Joe felt fine afterward, as if all his pain had disappeared. Joe was ecstatic, saying his headaches were gone and his vision had cleared, thanking Sharon. On the other hand, Maze rushed home and packed her things, ready to leave, unaware that Dan and Money were watching her. The 2 approached her, claiming they were sent by Joe to pick her up, but Maze didn't believe them and tried to fight back. However, Dan still managed to capture her. The next day, Max informed Antoinette of Joe's escape plan and his current location, prompting her to send all the assassins there, along with Max's mercenaries. Joe and Zivi's plan worked, as the assassins were heading to an old castle where Joe was waiting. Meanwhile, on their way to the castle, Dan revealed Joe's true identity to Maze, telling her that her boyfriend was Europe's #1 assassin. Joe prepared his equipment and waited for the assassin's arrival. The first to arrive were Rory and Angus. They entered and briefly talked to Joe before he threw a grenade at them. Joe descended and engaged the brothers in hand-to-hand combat, struggling against them. Joe kept fighting until Angus delivered a powerful kick, knocking him back. Outside, Ginny and Tanya arrived, armed to the teeth. As Rory and Angus argued over the accidental kick Angus gave Rory, Joe used his trap to impale Rory on a horn. Joe grabbed a smaller horn, and enraged by his brother's death, Angus fought fiercely with Joe. Despite Angus's martial arts skills, Joe managed to kill him by stabbing him in the throat. Suddenly, the two women arrived and opened fire. Joe quickly ran and returned fire with the gun he had taken from Angus. When he ran out of bullets, Ginny tried to approach, but she triggered Joe's trap, and a grenade explosion threw her back. Joe grabbed her body and activated the grenades before throwing it at Tanya. The explosion killed both women instantly. Joe was thrown by the blast and found Bodas standing in front of him. The two fought, and due to Bodas' swift movements, Joe struggled. Meanwhile, Dan arrived at the scene, but he realized it was a trap, and anyone who entered the castle would die. He ordered money to keep a close watch on Maze while he exited the vehicle. Joe and Bodas grabbed swords and continued their fight, but Bodas reached for a nearby gun. As Bodas fired, Joe quickly ran and used a table as a shield, which caused hidden wires to be pulled, setting off bombs that instantly killed Bodas. Afterward, Joe received a call from Maze's phone, but it was Dan, who revealed that he had captured her. Dan told Joe to meet him at a nearby cemetery if he wanted Maze to live, and Joe agreed to the deal. At that moment, Max and his mercenaries arrived at the castle to kill Joe. Meanwhile, Maze managed to trick the dim-witted Money by pretending to have a leg cramp and convincing him to let her out of the car. She assured him she wouldn't try to escape since she had nowhere to go, and Money allowed her to step out, but she hit him with a tree branch she had found. Inside, after blowing up most of the mercenaries, Joe continued killing them one by one. He exited through a tunnel and headed to the cemetery to meet Dan. After ordering Joe to drop his shotgun, Dan tried to call Money to bring Maze, but suddenly, a car rammed into him, with Maze behind the wheel. The two fled as Max fired at them, but they managed to escape. Money approached Dan to explain what had happened, and afterward, Dan asked Max to raise the bounty to $6 million. Meanwhile, Joe explained his job as a hitman to Maze, telling her that they didn't kill civilians, only criminals. He also told her about his current situation and his plans to retire, but Maze suddenly revealed that she was pregnant. Joe was overjoyed at the news and promised never to lie to her again, but at that moment, Maze fainted. Joe saw that she had been shot in the shoulder and took her out of the car to get her to safety, eventually arriving at a church. Inside, a priest approached them, but Maze suddenly regained consciousness. Joe was relieved and declared his love by proposing to her. Maze immediately accepted, and Joe asked the priest to marry them, but the priest said he would do so under one condition. Joe had to confess. The two talked, and Joe admitted to all his sins and killings, leading the priest to feel unqualified to absolve Joe of all his wrongdoings. However, Joe mentioned that he believed God had given him a second chance since he was going to be a father, so the priest agreed. On one condition, Joe must not kill again from now on. The priest began the wedding, and using a grenade pin as a ring, Joe and Maze vowed to stay together forever. However, the wedding was interrupted when Dan entered and shot the priest in the shoulder. Suddenly, a grenade was thrown near Dan by Max, who explained that Antoinette had refused Dan's request for a higher bounty, and now the mercenaries were planning to kill Dan too. After getting the priest and Maze to safety, Joe went outside to face the mercenaries. A shootout and several explosions followed, destroying the church and angering the priest. Max's last remaining mercenary approached Dan and fought him, but Max threw another grenade at them. Dan managed to dodge, but a platform collapsed on him, trapping him. Max approached and killed his injured mercenary before turning to Dan and attempting to kill him. However, Joe suddenly appeared, and the two aimed their guns at each other. Joe pulled the trigger, but his gun was empty. As Max boasted, Maze appeared and blew his head off with a shotgun. Joe approached the shocked Maze and they left, leaving Dan struggling. On the other hand, Antoinette tried to escape, but Zevi suddenly appeared, holding a gun. Antoinette asked who had placed the contract on her, and Zevi revealed that it was her, as she had sent a mercenary for a contract job, violating the law of their profession. After Zevi kills Antoinette, the scene shifts to Dan, who manages to survive, with rage in his eyes. In the final scene, Joe and Maze's wedding resumed at the same church, and the priest thanked Joe for the funds to repair the church. After receiving congratulations from the guests, including Zevi and Sharon, the newlyweds drove off to their honeymoon. Thank you so much for staying till the end. If you enjoy this video, please consider leaving a like, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for future uploads.